Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. One moment here. Okay. All right, so you should see a PowerPoint coming up here. All right, so this is writing the transfer essay. This is specifically for students who are transferring from Laurel Ridge Community College to another institution. You might have 2 years under your belt from Laurel Ridge, or you might have credits from different institutions. Doesn't matter, it applies to everybody. So we'll go ahead and get started with this. What we've got is a couple different ways to think about this. First off, most transfer applications include what's essentially a personal statement, and that's usually the essay that most people have to deal with. Sometimes you'll come across a common app where there are multiple essays included. I know I had a student who had one of the questions was, like what creative it was hobby, I believe. What creative hobby allows you to immerse yourself? And that was the essay. So there's different ones. They choose the other ones. But the personal statement is the one that's more consistent. So that's the one I'm going to focus on for us today. So for your application down at that third mark there, you need to be able to do a couple things. You need to be able to talk about yourself in a way that shows your dedication to academics, your focus on improving yourself, your involvement in community, and how you're valuable to an institution. And I think a lot of people forget that last little bit about how you're valuable to an institution. We just have to remember our purpose here. It's very, very important. We'll kind of get further into that. And then, of course, the bottom part is the thing that most people pay attention to. Is this is like your chance to make sure that they understand that you can communicate and that you can write clearly and that kind of thing. So that's something that is there. And what I find is that some students focus entirely on that, and then some people completely forget about that. So it's really necessary to not lose track. All right. So what we've got then in terms of the purpose, we've covered the first one, that ability to communicate. You need to be able to cover your background, and institutions really like varied backgrounds. They want to have students from different academic backgrounds, but also personal. So you want to be able to do this and do it in a really mature way. I think sometimes people struggle when they've transferred from a lot of institutions to talk about their last institutions in a positive way, and so that can get a little bit tricky, but that is ideal. So the next thing is making sure that you stick out, that you have a personality, that you're not just a GPA. And then, of course, the idea that you're going into an institution, they don't take a lot of transfer students into these places. So they really want to show that those transfer students can add to their just general community, that they're excited to be there, that kind of thing. And so that last point is really important to recognize for that. Okay. So this is kind of sad that I have this slide on here, but it's actually a really important thing to notice. A lot of people forget about this, is that sometimes it's very difficult to talk about yourself in a positive way. You're talking about your potential here. You're talking about what you can do for the remainder of the college credits that you need. So you're talking about your strengths, but also like what you can go towards. And so a lot of people struggle with this, especially if they don't have anything that they feel makes them really stick out. At the same time, like it's not necessarily about being this very unique person. It's about being a person who's well-rounded and headed in a great direction. So to talk about this, I want you to just realize a couple things, just a little bit of a cheerleading moment for yourself. You've gotten through a pandemic and you've gotten college credits during this. That alone, for some people, you can talk about that in a way that has complexity and depth. You're unique and valuable. You have a perspective that matters. They love perspective, and everybody is independent and unique. It's not that you don't have a perspective that's unique. It's that sometimes people don't show that very well. So that's kind of the trick to this. And then you want to think about your interests and that excitement to keep going. So you want to make sure that you're really showing that potential and your dedication, right? All of these things you have, sometimes people just forget about it. Okay. So that talking positively about yourself is the first point here. You also want to think about how you are a reflection of your institution, and you want to discuss your education positively. I mentioned this briefly. This is really important when you're thinking about specifically, how you've made changes and you want to go forward. And sometimes people struggle with explaining those changes, I should say. So, for example, if you have left a prior institution because you weren't fond of the program that you were in and you wanted to go to a different program, what you want to think about talking about is saying like what you do like and where you're headed, right? So what it is that you're excited about, why you made that change forward. So avoid looking back too much and focus forward on what you're excited about. That's really the best way to think about that. For a lot of my students who are leaving the 2-year, Laurel Ridge can be a small place. Sometimes people wish that they had more options for looking around at clubs and that kind of thing. And that makes sense because it's a small institution, but that shouldn't be the thing that you emphasize has held you back. Instead, you should say, I'm excited to get involved in these new opportunities in this new place that you're going to. So that's kind of the way to spin it, make sure you're positive. And of course, it's definitely truthful. I mean, that's why you're transferred, right? So the next thing is to make sure that if you have obstacles that you feel like you want to talk about, maybe that's why you transferred. Maybe you struggled a little bit in high school and you wanted to get your GPA kind of under control before you continued forward. That's not necessarily, shocking to anybody. So you just want to think about it in terms of something to overcome. I have grown from this, right? Rather than saying, and this held me back and this held me back, right? You want to make sure that you control this really well. Think about it in a positive way and how like all that you have is just open time to improve yourself and to go forward. And that's what another institution is going to give you the opportunity to do. The next thing, of course, you have an identity, and that gives you complexity and character. And so for my parents, if I have anybody in here who is a parent, having a kid is not something that should hold you back, but an element of your personality that should make you an important, unique perspective in college. And this is absolutely true. Colleges want people with varied perspectives. One of the best things that one of my professors ever said to me was, you want to go to college to meet people who you are not like you. And colleges recognize that and want to foster that. So talking about this and saying like how you have grown from your unique scenarios is something that they'll want to see. Okay. So I'm going to go one more slide and then I'll see if anybody's got questions. Or two more actually, because they kind of go together. All right, so in terms of how to think about how you are unique, I'm going to talk about these as kind of examples so that you can, process it. Now, personal statement, it's usually what they're asking you is, why are you excited to head into a transfer institution? Or what are you planning to do in your next institution? Or why do you want to be there, right? And so you want to control this really well, make it nice and specific to yourself. So we have the first one is choosing that specific route. I'm driven to make a mark in public health and aim to fix the very issue that drove my mother into debt. Like that's something that a lot of people have experienced. And then having that personal connection to something that's very academic makes a lot of sense, and they'll be excited to have you for that. Talking about your family and background makes sense, especially if you're going into something that has kind of a disconnect from family background, but you know that it's there. Drawing these connections in your life are really important and show that dedication is very deep in what you're thinking. So that's a great way to talk about, kind of a Hawaiian concept there. The last one, you might have a specific experience that drives your dedication to your field. And this line, I want to draw attention to it because it can be very, very helpful. That's what it took my father's hands helping the calf walk, right? So if you're going into agriculture, if you want to go to tech, having a scene like that can be really, really helpful. In fact, in general, if you want to make your personal statement a little bit scene oriented or descriptive, that makes sense. And it can make it very approachable and personal and show your creative skills, your communication skills. For people who want to do that, though, I think it can get a little bit tricky. So you want to make sure it's really controlled. I always say, pay attention to your word count. I wouldn't develop more than 4 or 5 sentences in that direction. And you kind of use that as a transition back to talking about your potential and where you're headed. All right, one more slide in this kind of realm, and then I'll pause. So we have, you might have an interest in an opportunity or path that the university offers. I do recommend that you research where you're headed. If you are focused on going into the sciences and specifically laboratory science or maybe medical, you want to see what opportunities they have for students at the institution that you're looking at and see if you can specify it towards them. So for example, if you notice that they're bringing in undergraduates to assist tagging turtle populations, for example, and you're going to go into ecology, community, then referencing that and saying that you hope to do that shows that you're doing the work, you're thinking about it, and you're kind of processing what it is that you are hoping to get involved in. Remember, they want you to be an involved, active person in their community, and then having that connected to academia is just even sweeter. So that's definitely a goal there. There's also the drive to make connections between academia and community in general is nice. So the dentistry option there is a good idea for those of you who are going into a field that is, very practical, often for, like financially driven. It's really important to show that you're thinking about this in a well-rounded way. You show your interest and you can make connections to like your general social dedication. So in other words, dentistry for me is also a chance to provide free services too, which by the way, a lot of dentists do, and it's fantastic. They do a lot of volunteer stuff. So that kind of, open heart concept, that you're dedicating yourself to can be really important. And then the last one here is, it's nice to cross between academic viewpoints. You are a well-rounded person. You've done different types of classes. You're going into a place where you're going to be more focused. And so it's really important to show that well-roundedness in how you're thinking about your next academic path, especially for those people who are trying to kind of dig for different things to make themselves interesting. So I kind of stole an idea from my English 241 class. Studying Poe for a paper in English 241 during the pandemic woke up so much of my curiosity about how we viewed infectious disease in the past. And so for those of you who are thinking about going into medical, this kind of reference can really show that you are, an active student, an active learner, and that you're thinking about things in a complex way. Okay, so those are just options, right? You don't have to follow any of these, but I think they're the things that people tend to overlook. Okay, so do I have any questions so far? All right. We have our silence. That's cool. Make sure we don't have a lot of people in here. Oh, I have something in the chat. Let me see. We don't have, oh, thank you, Michael. Okay, none here. All right, so that makes sense. I'll just keep us going. You feel free to, I'll keep the chat open. Feel free to let me know through that. Or if you just want to speak, that's cool too. There's not too many people in here, so it wouldn't be too overwhelming. Okay. So those last two slides are really nice because I think a lot of people don't think about this in that way. And then this is kind of more of the reminder stuff that a lot of people do think about, but we definitely don't want to forget. So, okay. So when we're thinking about this, remember that you want your writing to stand out, but it needs to be short and controlled. So I designed this slide because when you go online and you look at the different, recommendations, there's a lot of do's and don'ts. And it's not necessarily a bad way to think about it. But what I like to think about this instead of is a balance in terms of your options. So you want to balance between extremes. So in other words, you can make your writing stand out, but it still needs to be really controlled. You can't get too flowery, too detailed, right? You want to make sure that you're coming across in a very even-keeled manner. Remember that you want to use complex vocabulary and correct sentence structure, but it needs to be clear. You don't need to go for vocabulary that's so far into the profession that you're going to go into that the reader is not going to understand it. Remember that your admissions person is probably associated with the major you're going into, potentially. Sometimes they're not at all. So you can't assume that they have any prior knowledge there. So it's more like you're explaining it to somebody who's just generally in academia. Remember that you want to present your complexity and voice, but you need to remember your audience and give them the context they need. So in other words, make sure you don't just go too far deep into your personality and your background without kind of bringing it back to why this matters. It's very, very important for every structure within this essay to be very connected to why this matters and how this fulfills the question. So you always want to keep your text kind of in mind. And if you go through and you're like, oh, this sentence doesn't quite fit like the question itself for the essay, then you remove it or revise it. Remember that description and scene-oriented language can show off your skills. It's excellent piece of advice. That is really a great way to connect with people. But again, this content has to be useful to your greater point, or it seems excessive. And I find this a lot when I teach a narrative essay, when I teach English 111, and I find that the students who get really excited to do description often will give us description that we don't need. And that's tricky. And it's kind of, it's a paper where they kind of get to play around a little bit. So I don't mind it too much. But in this scenario, that's definitely a dangerous point. So if you're going to do that scene focused work, make sure that it's really working for you and that it's fairly brief too. Okay. Okay, so you want to remember these are the things that people forget. And this is in part because you're probably forming it in an online format. So you want to make sure that you're still remembering punctuation, paragraphs, and consistency and tense. For those of you who are thinking about doing descriptive stuff, consistency and tense really gets thrown off. So you'll move like between past and present often in that scenario. And then paragraphs are really shockingly important. It is the way that I always say that's how you digest a meal, is you break it up into edible pieces, right? It's how you would eat a steak, right? You chop it up. And it's the same concept for a paper. If you don't, or an essay, if you don't chop up your middle points, you'll kind of lose track of those. The next thing is remembering to plan your essay out. Obviously, that's something that you have to think about. But what I find is that my students kind of get stuck into like last patterns that they use. Sometimes they just start typing and then try to figure it out later. If you just list out your different options for your topic first, so give yourself 5 options, potential topics, you can get rid of the rough ones and either be more confident in the first one that you are really dedicated to, or choose a better one. Then create primary points that the topic should cover. So you just list these things off. You can do an outline format if you wish, but no matter what, if you just list where you're headed in the paper, it's much, much easier for your brain. And then this can also help you then think about paragraph structure. Each element within it doesn't necessarily need to be one paragraph. We don't necessarily work that way. One can be expanded on more than the other. And so you can just write, 1 paragraph, 2 paragraphs next to each point. This is just a simple outline, but even for a basic essay like this, it can be really, really important so that you don't end up in the conclusion and essentially repeat your introduction, right? Okay, so speaking of that, you want an introduction and a conclusion, but these shouldn't be formulaic. Be creative in how you deliver info and give your work purpose. We are not doing introductions and conclusions like you did them in high school, obviously, right? We're in a college level, and this is very important for this essay to do this. So if you want to think about it in terms of an introduction, you are introducing yourself and the topic you're about to cover, and that's really the only requirement. You don't have to have a thesis necessarily. That's not a bad idea, but we don't need a pre-structured layout for a thesis. And then in your conclusion, we certainly do not need a repetition of your introduction. These are very short essays. So your conclusion should probably take us back to the original purpose. And so if it's that explain yourself and your reason for transferring, then you want to come back to the concept of what you can look forward to and kind of round it out at the end. For some people, when they're doing the scene thing, they use that as an introduction and they transfer that into why this matters for them. And it kind of gives them that nice pull in to the essay. And then they also know to stop it fairly early and keep moving forward with explaining why this matters. But in either way, no matter how you do this, just make sure that you're doing this in a creative way so that it does stick out. Okay. Do I have any questions? All right. So you all look good. I'll move this forward.
Good here.
Oh, yes. Okay. And this is my last slide. So I'll ask for questions here after this one, and then we can make sure we're all good. Lastly, these are the things that I think people, they know, but they often forget, or they don't give themselves enough time to really think about them. So if you're worried about vocabulary and descriptions and control, where you want to think about this is using unique verbs and sentence variation. but always do this in a way that doesn't distract, right? So control is valuable. If you want to think about unique verbs and unique descriptors, just think about the fact that the words good and bad are some of the worst words in the English language, right? We need words that actually tell us specifically why something is good or why something is bad. And so this is kind of a good kicking off point. Once you write your essay, you can return to it and then go through, find your verbs and find your descriptors and see which ones you can improve on to show your true vocabulary. But then you also don't want to go too far with this. The second point seems kind of obvious. The next one, I'm sure these admissions counselors have gotten plagiarism in these essays and notice that they're going to be aware of that. They're also going to have the same software that we have as English professors. So just note that that's really not going to do you any favors. And then the last thing is kind of a process that you want to think about in terms of how to actually form these things. Read your work multiple times as you go. You'll feel more comfortable. You'll better understand it. Do a couple drafts. Give yourself the time to build paragraphs and actually think about structure. If you do this last minute, that can really throw off the essay itself. And then, of course, you want to use the tools available to you, like spell check. That seems obvious, but it depends on how you're attaching it. And then finally, have someone else read your work for feedback and aim high for this. If you have your friend do this, they may not actually know how to do punctuation. And so it can be rough to have somebody assist you in terms of small edits. But sometimes it's more important to just say like, hey, does this make sense? And what else should I explain? Kind of bigger questions about it rather than small editing. And then, of course, that the end point is shocking. How many of my students do not do this? As always reading your essay out loud. This will give you the option of recognizing your own tone. You can see if one of your sentences kind of fumbles your tongue a little bit and you have to go back and figure out why it's structurally confusing. You commonly find errors, sentence level errors with punctuation just by doing this. So that's pretty straightforward. You can also go up the page, and this is something that I make my students do. But if you're like you've looked at this thing for too long and it's driving you wild, if you go up the page and read up, then you lose the context of the sentences around it. So you're more likely to find your small errors. So if I were to do this on the slide, it would be always read your essay out loud. And then for crafting this, read your work multiple times, do a couple drafts, give yourself the time to build paragraphs, and finally use the tools available to you like spell check and having someone else read your work for feedback. If you plagiarize your work, right? So in other words, if you move up, and I actually noticed that my list is not parallel there in that third bullet point. And so it's really important to recognize how allowing your brain to view this in a unique way will help you to find those small errors. Okay. Now, do we have questions?
Not really.
Not really? Okay. All right. Well, I can, this generally covers kind of the basics of this stuff. If you're worried about this kind of thing, it's great to have somebody look at your stuff. It's great to talk to people about it. I'm sure we have our tutoring group in the library, and they also use BrainFuse, and you can have somebody check it out for you there. So there's lots of options. But in terms of what I find is that when you come across examples online and when you come across my examples like these, you may not fulfill them, and that's fine. This isn't about fulfilling a formula. This is more about trying to find ways to point out why you're going to school, why you're driven to go to school, and where you want to go next in terms of like your career and how that university can help you. You're always representing yourself and the university that you are in or the college that you are in. And so they want you to show how positively you can present yourself now so that you can do that for them in the future. All right, cool. All right, so if we're feeling good, I'll go ahead and stop recording and then you guys can hang for a second. Stop my share. Let's go ahead and stop. Thank you.